Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for today's video cast. We're continuing our examination of the ancient world. This again is the longest period in the periodization scheme we're using in class. In the past day or two, we've looked at the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras. Starting today, we're going to focus on the third key concept, the rise of urban civilization and the consequences it has on human populations. Three focus questions. Again, these are not something you need to write down anywhere, but you should be able to answer them to the best of your ability by the end of the presentation. First of all, what exactly is a civilization? The verb that we're using here is to identify. Second, how did civilizations develop? In other words, what exactly was the process of transitioning to urban civilizations? The verb there is to describe. And most challenging, why did they develop in the first place? Why did human beings start living in this system that we call a civilization? The verb there is to explain. Now, these three verbs are crucial in everything we do. And it's not just because of what we do in class. They're the verb stems that are the basis for the questions that you will have to write responses to on the AP test at the end of the year. So again, these are the questions to sort of keep in mind as we go through. But to tell the story of how we got to civilization, we need to back up a little bit. How exactly did we get from foragers to cities in the first place? Well, we're going to start with the affluent foragers. In the Mesolithic period, you might remember, there were so many good plants and animals to hunt and gather that in certain places people became semi-sedentary. In other words, they were not permanently settled, but they stayed in one place for a significant period of time, returned back to it over and over. One site to note that demonstrates this is in modern Turkey, a place called Göbekli Tepe, where they had built what appears to be a kind of temple, a structure that was designed for some sort of spiritual purpose. But again, the main idea here is this was a site that people returned to over and over and over again. Again, suggesting a kind of semi-sedentary life way. And we don't know a whole lot about it, but it does appear that this was something that was of spiritual value to these people, some sort of perhaps public ritual that was done on a certain time every year, and so everybody returned back to it. Then when we get to the Neolithic Revolution, we start to see the first sedentary farmers. These people are living in communities of about a dozen of people. Now, notice they're not significantly bigger than the groups of affluent foragers, but the big difference is they don't move anymore. An early settlement of sedentary farmers is depicted in this drawing, a sort of imagining what Banpo in East Asia, in what is now China, might have looked like. And a couple of things you'll note in this image. The smaller structures would have each had a particular family, but there's one large structure in the middle. And we think that was not like the leader's dwelling, that was the meeting place. Most of the early communities of sedentary farmers were led by a council of elders, and so this is likely the place where the whole community would meet. The council would discuss options for courses of actions, and everybody would debate it essentially before a decision was made. Also note there's a kind of moat around the structure, so it does provide some security. You can see a mountain in the background, but the actual farming would have taken place outside of that structure that contained their living spaces. Then we get to agrarian villages. Now we're starting to get into hundreds of people living together in smaller areas. Two sites to note include Jericho and Çatalhöyük. Jericho, you might recall from the Bible, the city with the Great Wall. This is a picture. This isn't the the village itself, but it is the granary of the village where they would have stored their surplus grain. But you will notice there is, in fact, a wall around it. And again, in modern Turkey, a pretty famous site, Çatalhöyük. Here is an artist's reconstruction of what it might have looked like. One thing I want you to note, though, is if you look at these structures, first of all, people seem to be moving in and out of those structures via the roof, but most of the structures are about the same size. And so even though you've got all of these people living in more densely packed situations, there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of social stratification based on the sizes of the dwelling. Most of the dwelling spaces are about the same, which suggests some degree of social egalitarianism. Then finally, in a few areas, we start to get the first cities. Now we're talking about clusters of thousands of people stacked into a smaller space. Two that are sort of among the earliest that ever appear in Mesopotamia, which is on the Tigris River. This is a computer-generated image, and one thing to note here is that giant space in the center that includes structures for public worship, but also palaces, because now, as we'll see, we start to get a new form of government once we get into cities. Mohenjo-Daro, one of the big cities in the Indus Valley civilization, again, this is a computer-generated image, but one of the things I want you to notice here is how clearly planned out this structure is. This is a feature that is significant for the Indus Valley civilization's cities. They do all appear to be laid out on a grid in a very similar fashion. So now we've got these people packed more and more tightly into smaller spaces. So then how do we get from cities to civilizations? Well, first of all, what happened? Well, what happened is there appears to be a tipping point in demographic density. In other words, these cities get so big and so many people so tightly packed, at some point there's like this flip, this switch from just being a city to being a civilization. The problem, though, is we're not exactly sure what that number is. And we don't know. Is it the case that it's more or less the same for cities around the world? Was it different in different places? The truth is we really don't know. And this is something we're going to come back to. Trying to define what exactly a civilization, it turns out, is much more challenging than it might first appear. However, we do know a little bit more of how it happened, what the process is. For example, we know that it is based on agricultural production, that particularly domesticated plants, the most valuable, nutritious ones in particular, were crucial to this, that even pastoral nomads who had domesticated animals, with very few exceptions, don't have actual cities that turn into civilizations. So it does appear there's some relationship to agricultural production by domesticating plants. It also appears geography plays a crucial role in this. The core civilizations, the first civilizations that appear in Afro-Eurasia, all appear in river valleys, and they're all places that either originally had high quality plants and animals available for domestication, or they're places where those plants and animals diffused very early on and then could easily be supported there. All of this put together, though, leads to a food surplus, and it does definitely appear that that is a crucial part of this transition from just being a city to a civilization, because that food surplus, as we have seen, will lead to job specialization, and while we've talked repeatedly about how that affects technological innovation, it also leads to new social structures, new political structures, new forms of labor. Just to take one particular case, to have a standing army, basically a professional class of warriors, you're going to need a food surplus that could support people to do nothing but defend your city, for example. So again, we know a little bit more about how all of this happens, but the question about why it happens at all, we just don't know. Like, there's why should it be this way? There's no really good answer to that question. Now, there are several historians who have put forth various theories. We will talk a little bit more about those at various points in the future, but this points again to a fundamental problem. What exactly is a civilization? If we can't come up with a clear definition, it's going to be hard to try to figure out why did it occur at all. On the other hand, the activity that we're going to do in class tomorrow, you're going to see there's really, really, really fundamental problems with using the term civilization at all. So rather than trying to figure out a formal definition for civilization, we're going to take a slightly different approach. You might be a civilization if you have these 5 things, okay? I call these the 5 features of civilization. Now, they're a variation of a basic idea that's been part of social studies education for generations. So you might see similar lists. I've sort of modified them for our particular purposes. But again, the big idea here is rather than trying to define what a civilization is, what we're going to do is we're going to look at groups of people. Do they have these 5 things? And if they do, then they're likely a civilization. The first of these features is urbanization. The basic idea here is civilizations develop from cities. And in fact, our word civilization has as its root a Latin word, cives, which means a citizen of the city of Rome. That is, somebody who lives in that city. City dwellers, then, is the first sort of feature of any civilization. But second is a state-level government. Now, this word state does not mean what here in the United States, the way we typically use that. The way Tennessee, for example, is a state in the United States. A state government means that there is a centralization of power, that power is focused typically in one individual. And for almost all civilizations, that one individual is known as a king. Now, an important distinction to be made here between chiefdoms and kingdoms. Chiefs, which some of the agrarian villages that emerged in the Neolithic Revolution were led by a chief who is an individual who exercises power just like a king. But the difference is a chief has his power through charisma and reciprocity. Charisma, in other words, he gets people to follow him because they like him, they trust him, and one of the big ways they do that is reciprocity, by gifts. So that the chief basically is building confidence in his leadership, and that's why people follow him. Kings, on the other hand, are different because they have the monopoly on the use of force to get people to follow whatever rules they want to set up as part of their power. So even if a king doesn't exactly use force on his own people, it's the threat of force that is the basis of his power. If you think about, like, what is the punishment if you break the law? Well, that's a form of coercion. That's a form of power, but only the state has that. Like, you can't just go around and exact your own justice because you're ticked off at somebody. The state has that authority. So that's what we mean by the word state. However, once you have power concentrated in one individual source, namely a king, the king cannot do everything to administer the power of the state. And so one of the aspects of a state government is we start to see a bureaucracy. That is to say, people who are doing the actual work of running the state government. So it's the bureaucrats who are the ones who are administering justice in the name of the state. It's the bureaucrats who are the one who are managing resources and keeping track of who's paying their taxes and how those taxes are then redistributed to everybody else. So again, these two features are combined to what we call a state-level government. And we'll see there's different ways of doing that for different civilizations. But a third feature is social stratification. As we've seen over the course of the Neolithic period, slowly there starts to be more and more differentiation and the emergence of different classes of people, some of whom are sort of higher status than others. By the time we get to civilizations, though, this is a very distinctively, quote, civilized feature. What do we mean by a hierarchy of class, though, is essentially the distribution, or if you want to think it, redistribution of wealth and power. That is to say, wealth and power becomes concentrated among a few people, and we call those people elites. That is, these are the people at the top of the social hierarchy. For many civilizations, they are the bureaucrats. They're the ones who are actually running the government. Frequently, they are priests or people administering the spiritual life of the community. Typically, we have a class of commoners, free people, but who do not have the social advantages of the elites. Slavery was practiced in many, but not all of the earliest civilizations. Typically, slaves were conquered enemies, soldiers that were fighting against them and then defeated. But again, slavery is a huge issue in world history, and we'll definitely go into more detail about that in the future. But the idea now, though, is while slaves were at the bottom of social hierarchies where they existed, it does not appear that every civilization actually had slaves. And another aspect to this is this word patriarchy, that growing differential between the power of men over women. And this is a feature, again, it's different in different civilizations, but it does distinguish this notion that in civilizations there's very clear lines and a balance of power between certain groups over other groups. A fourth feature, then, is what we call public works. Public works are large-scale labor projects. First of all, let's just look at the large-scale labor part. If you have job specialization, you're going to have a large group of people whose job is to build and make stuff. Those people are building and making stuff for the state. So part of the state government is they have to be able to control and manage the work of these people who are the laborers. They do that in two ways. One is what we call infrastructure. These are building projects, labor projects that typically benefit the whole community. So for example, building and maintaining irrigation systems. Who does that benefit? Well, it benefits the farmers who are farming that land, but of course that food is going to the food surplus that is sustaining the life of the city, which is the basis of their civilization. Temples, similarly, it's for the worship of the whole community. Defensive walls are a really big one in many cities, because who benefits from the wall? Well, everybody in the city benefits from the wall if they're being attacked from somebody else. So again, infrastructure projects, they're ushering the labor force to build something that is for the public good. But another version of public works is what we call monumental architecture. And whereas this is seen as generally sort of good for the whole community, the purpose of monumental architecture is to project and maintain the power of the state. So, for example, if you think of palaces, why are palaces so big and so fancy? Why is the king's house so much bigger and more elaborate than everybody else's? Well, part of its function is everybody looks at it, goes, wow, whoever lives there must be a pretty cool dude. I guess it's okay that he's going to be the leader. But as we'll see, this also includes things like giant buildings that are used for the funeral of a particular king, so that even after death, the enormity of the monumental architecture, its purpose is to impress anybody who sees it, so that they recognize the power of the person that does that. And then fifth, and in my heart most importantly, is writing. Writing is an essential feature of all civilizations, though as we'll see, different forms of writing appear in different parts of the world. And one of the keys, though, is the original purpose for almost every writing system was to record transactions. And it makes sense if you stop and think about it. Like, for example, paying taxes. If you have a state government, you pay taxes. Like, taxes are as old as civilization. Nobody likes it, gotta have it. Well, how do you know who has paid what in their taxes? So let's say if you're living in a particular city, but you're the farmer and your tax is you have to pay I don't know, X number of bushes of grain for your taxes. The original purpose for most writing systems was to record who had paid what. And that's a pretty valuable function for a state government, because otherwise, first of all, you would have no idea what you're getting from whom. But second of all, this is a way to sort of ensure that whatever the taxation system that you're trying to implement is actually working. However, very quickly on, most civilizations recognized, well, we could actually use this writing system for things that have nothing to do with recording transactions. And so in most of the civilizations, we start to get writing down stories, writing down events, recording what is happening, the earliest forms of what we would call history or in literature, for example. But again, as we'll see, though, that's not exactly the way it unfolds in every place. There are some distinctions about what the purposes of writing were and what exactly you call writing. But they all have some way to sort of record what is happening, the transactions being done between people and the state and between people and other people. So these 5 features, then, this is going to be the focus of a lesson that we're going to do later on in the week. Rather than focusing on a formal definition, our approach is going to be, do you have these 5 things? And if you do, it's likely that you are a civilization. So let's come back to our focus questions for today. What is a civilization? Well, again, trying to define it, and the activity we're doing tomorrow is a very challenging thing. Rather than focusing on what it is, we're focusing on what are the features of it. How did it develop? Well, we know that there was this gradual movement from sedentary communities of a few dozen people to sedentary communities of a few dozen people, and then hundreds of people, and later thousands of people, until we get to this point where the demographic density, the number of people living in a small space, gets to a tipping point and it flips over. We don't know where that tipping point is, but we do know that it involves the agricultural production, particularly based on plants, and the best case scenario, both plants and animals. We know that it has to do with river valleys and the access to the good plants and animals in order to produce a food surplus that allows for job specialization, that allows all of those features that we just saw for civilization to be developed in the first place. And again, the 5 features of civilization cannot happen unless there is a food surplus, which in the case of civilizations based on agricultural production. And then coming back to this question of why did they develop in the first place? This is a challenge. There's a lot we don't know or understand about how to answer this question. One thing I want to point out, though, in many of the discussion activities that we do in class, and also in the writing tasks that you're going to have to do for the AP test, explaining that verb explain something. Why does it happen? That is really a challenge. That's because it's not an answer that you just, you learn it, you memorize it, or you regurgitate it. You have to sort of put all of the pieces together to speculate a little bit in an intelligent way. So these are the 3 focus questions that you need to have answered or understand. You should have filled in the blanks as we were going through the presentation today. Again, annotate in the margins. If you are in my class, I want to point out this is just the front side of the outline. The back will be for tomorrow's presentation. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll see you guys in class. Thanks.